Today, friends, we are going to conclude the discussion of deconstruction that we have initiated from last 4 lectures. Now, the another important issue of deconstruction is bricolage. BRICOLAGE. Now, the other option, which is Levi Strauss's choice, is to keep using the structure, use structure again and again, but to recognize that it is unstable, that the terms it set up won't always stay neatly in their designated places, but will have play always in it. We have seen that what kind of play that Derrida means by. But Levi Strauss is always trying to keep using the whole structure. Now, in Derrida's terms, this means that the system can no longer claim to be true, but rather that it must acknowledge itself as a construct, as something built around a central idea which has chosen to try to keep everything in place, even though it ultimately cannot keep play away. It cannot keep the play away. Play will be there. Now, Derrida and Levi Strauss call this method bricolage, and a person who does it, a bricoleur, BRICOLEUR. Now, a bricoleur doesn't care about the purity or stability or truth of a system. Whatever truth of a system he is using, he never takes care of the system. He never takes care of the purity or stability or truth of that particular system, but rather uses what's there to get a particular job done. Now, in a philosophical term, I might want to talk about a belief system and refer to God, because that's a useful signifier for something, because a lot of people believe in it. Let me make it clear very, very frankly, my friends, that I don't assume that God refers to an actual being or even to a coherent system of beliefs. Coherent system of beliefs that situate God at a center, and then it provides a fixed code of interpretation or behavior. The deconstructive reading uses a lot of quotation mark. This deconstructive reading is a way of indicating that you are using a signifier or a certain signifier as if it had a stable meaning. You are aware of that, and it doesn't. Now, if you see very carefully, my friends, bricolage doesn't worry about the coherence of words or ideas it uses. For example, you are a bricklayer if you are talking about Oedipus complex without knowing anything about psychoanalysis. This is what happens with most of us in the society. What happens in society? They talks we usually talk of certain things which are not familiar to us, nor we are able to find out certain grounded situation in it. Now, this is how a bricklayer used to work, not knowing what exactly is in the system, but he's commenting on the system, he's talking on the system. Even as a bricklayer, you can use the terms without acknowledging the validity or truth. What is happening nowadays, if you put this situation in a contemporary phase, you will find out that this is the situation which is part of today's what social media you are having with you. Without validating the truth, without acknowledging the validity of the statement that what you uttered, they're trying to put the truth of the system that produces these ideas. Bricolage understands meaning not as something eternal and immutable, but as something provisional, something shifting. Derrida contrasts the bricklayer to the engineer. Derrida contrasts the bricklayer to the engineer. The engineer designs building which have to be solid and have little or no play, because the engineer wants to uh, create a stable system. Now, Derrida talks about the engineer as the person who sees himself as the center of his own discourse, the origin of his own language. Now, this guy, engineer, thinks he speaks language. It is a sort of language you can say. He originates language. from his own unique uh, existence and experience. He is speaking of all those things. And what the humanists do, humanist is usually an engineer in this respect, if you think. Because the humanist, liberal humanist, which we talked in when we are discussing structuralism, the humanist is usually behave like an engineer because they think they have developed their own language, they have originated the language with their own existence and experience. Now, the idea of bricolage produces a new way to talk about and think about systems and structures without falling into the trap of trying to build a new stable system. They're not interested in constructing a new stable system. They don't want to construct it. Out of that whole ruins of deconstructed one. Bricolage produces a new way to talk about and think about systems and structures, and this bricolage is not falling into the trap of trying to build a new stable system, because building a new stable system out of those deconstructed ruin, you're not going to build a new system. And that's why bricolage or bricular knew this, and it provides, my friend, it provides a way to think, a way to think without establishing a new center, or you can say a privileged reference, or an origin, or a truth. Bricolage provides a way to think without establishing a new center, or you can say a truth, or you can say an origin, or you can say a privileged reference. It try to establish, it provides that without establishing a new center, using the old one. It want to create a structure once again. It also inspires, my friend, creativity and originality, making possible new ways of putting things together. Because you are not disturbing, you are not creating anything, not putting the new center. If you put a new center, you have to build up everything new. But instead of putting a new center or telling something, it tries to create with the old center itself. That means you have to recreate it. All systems fall on continuum between infinite play and eternal stability. And this is what Derrida argues. Derrida argues that Western culture has always preferred and desired systems that seem to be stable, and that promise to always remain stable. To the approach, what he calls full presence, full presence with no play or fluidity or interdeterminacy. Such systems, my friend, are of course impossible. Because if you try to create such type of systems which are not having any sort of you can say play or fluidity or interdeterminacy, because what Derrida speaks about the play, that it is always there. But if you want to build up system, then it is impossible, because every system contains its own contradictions and instabilities, which deconstruction can uncover, because that is what a role of deconstruction is. Deconstruction is uncovering every system with its own contradictions and instabilities. That is what deconstruction used to find it out. That's what we have discussed right from last 4 lectures. The system of language of which every text is made has no discernible center. Or I can say it in simple word that there is no god of language that determines what the word means by. As a language users, we want language to work in both ways. We want language to be stable structure so that words have definite meaning. When I say pass the salt, when we are on the dining table, I say pass the salt. Now I want you to know what I mean without having anything to interpret of my words. These are the very straightforward words. You need not to have any different interpretations of the word, because it is absolutely based on the context, that particular place where you are talking about. And we want language to have lots of play, to be ambiguous, so that we can have multiple meanings of single word. And that's what makes pun and poetry possible, because in poetry and in pun you can have multiple meanings of one word. We might want to distinguish between everyday language, where we use words to communicate and hope that those words which are having a relatively fixed meaning, and literary language, where we use words for their fluidity. That is the difference between literary language and everyday use of language. That's how we have to understand this difference of language. In everyday language, whatever words we use for communication, those words are having their own fixed meaning. Just as I said, pass the salt. But if you are using a literary language requires fluidity, because the play of words is pleasurable. It gives a lot of meaning. It helps you to understand what exactly it means by. And that's why in literary language, we have to understand that this play is always being accepted. This helps us to find out how the text can be read against itself. How we can able to find out the textual subconsciousness that we have discussed a couple of days back. where meanings are directly contrary to the surface meanings. When it is possible, it is possible only when there is a play in language, and especially in literary language, you will find out there is a requirement of play. You cannot have a fixed meaning as you find out in everyday, day to day communication. And that's why deconstruction urges to think beyond what is given as absolute knowledge into the area of unheard, unthought thoughts. If you can able to find out these things, then you are deconstructing that particular text. Now it is on, it depends upon you that how you use deconstruction to carry forward, to run with your own ideas of research that you are going to pursue. Now, what we talked about, how this general deconstruction, the idea of deconstruction propagated by Jacques Derrida, still deconstruction, there might be something which we need to understand from different areas, especially America and India. What sort of deconstruction we have? There's American deconstruction and there's deconstruction in India also. With these two important points, we'll try to come to an end of this discussion. So please understand that deconstruction is naturally influenced by Derridian ideas. But if you see deconstruction in America is guided by the history of literary criticism in USA. There are few thinkers who use deconstruction very categorically in their works. Paul D. Mann, P-A-U-L, Paul, D, D-E, D small, Mann, M-A-N, M capital. Paul D. Mann's a very famous book written in 1971, Blindness and Insight, and Allegories of Reading, published in 1979. Or you will find out another American thinker, Harold Bloom, whose book, A Map of Misreading, written in 1975, or Geoffrey Hartman's The Fate of Readings, or you will find out the very interesting book written by Jeffrey Hartman's Criticism in Wilderness, written in 1980, or J.H. Miller, J.H. Miller's Deconstruction of Fiction in his very famous book Fiction and Reputation, 1982, or Barbara Johnson's The Critical Difference, written in 1980. These are some important works within the deconstructionist paradigm. These critics also been referred as to the Yale School, Y-A-L-E. Friends, American deconstruction has come out of the formalism of new critics. Again, formalism we are going to study in the next semester. And Coleridge's romantic notion of organic form. These two things are at the background of American deconstruction. American deconstructionists discover more multiplicity and contradictions in the natural organic form. They base their observation on the close reading, as I said you yesterday, what is meant by close reading. Finding out the traces, difference, and supplementary. What Paul Deman says, Paul Deman shows that reading is always necessarily a misreading. What Paul Deman says, what Paul Deman shows, that reading is always necessarily misreading. Using the romantic crisis poems of Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, and Tennyson, Bloom Johnson, sorry, Harold Bloom demonstrates how each poet creatively misreads the work of his predecessors. He shows in his book, Map of Misreading. Or Paul Deman's reading of the closing lines of Yeats's poem among the school children is a good example of contrary reading. In the poem, if you see the last four lines of the poem, I'll read those last four lines of the poem. I'm reading those four lines, which he, Paul Demans pointed out that these closing lines of Yeats' poem among the school children. I'm reading the lines. O chestnut tree, great rooted blossomer, are you the leaf, the blossom, or the bole? O body swayed to music, O brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance? Now the concluding questions which was asked at the end of the poems. Traditionally, it has been taken as a statement of the potential unity between, you can say, form and experience. It is unity of form and experience. That is what usually a critic used to say about the last questions that has been asked in the poem, or between a creator and creation. If you see those last lines, these last lines have been read figuratively and always considered as a rhetorical question rather than literary, since it is taken for granted that figurative reading is more knowledgeable. That is a very common following. Figurative reading is supposed to be the most knowledgeable thing. But the lines can be read in a very literal sense, my friend. For example, when your friend asked you whether you are interested in postmodernism or post-structuralism, then instead of answering, you ask a question. What is the difference? Now, your reply could mean that you are uh, really interested in knowing the difference, and that you are literally asking for the difference between the two. Or it could mean that you tried your best and that you are exhausted, and that's why you don't care much about difference in between these two things. What is the meaning of this particular question? You asked a counter question to the person. What is the condition? Why you are asking the same question? He asks you a question that what is the difference, whether you are interested in postmodernism or post-structuralism. Instead of answering the question, you said, what is the difference in the two? Now, this doesn't mean that you don't want to answer the question. There might be three possibilities into it. That you are really interested in knowing the difference, or you're literally asking for showing the difference, that you are the studious person, you studied it very well, so please give me the difference between the two things. Or the third thing can be you are exhausted with finding out the difference and you didn't find anything, and that's why you are asking to your friend when he asked the question. Now, when you asked the counter question, this question is rhetorical and figurative. This question is rhetorical. Similarly, Paul Deman demonstrates the question that how can we know the dancer from the dance? It can be read literally to mean what is the meaning of this particular sentence. That please tell me how can I know the dancer from the dance? That is a very simple thing you are asking. Now, this may lead to a greater complications of theme and statement, since the dancer and dance are not the same. That's why you have asked this particular question. Now, the contradictory readings or double logic shows the incompatibility and a mutually dependent interweaving of pluralistic perspectives as the basis of meaning and at the sort of interpretation that you did. American deconstruction deals in this format, in this way, with the text. If this is the condition in American deconstruction, which was, as I said, influenced by Derridian ideas, so it is not out of the Derridian ideas, it carries Derridian ideas in itself. Then what is the condition of deconstruction in India if you try to find it out? In India, which is a pluralistic subcontinent, we are not multilingual, but we are plural. Various languages are spoken. And scholars have always used a deconstructive thinking. Of course, without using an equivalent term in Indian languages. We don't have any equivalent term in Indian languages for this deconstruction, but we have used it. In India, Indians have used deconstructions quite before Derrida, but we don't have any proper term to it. For example, if you look into the history, in the first or second century AD, a Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna asked this question, the same question as Paul Deman asks in American Deconstruction. Paul Deman is asking this question in 1970s, but Nagarjuna asked this question in first or second century. What Nagarjuna asks a question: how can we know the goer from the action of going? Goer means the person who performs the action. Goer. How can we know the goer? Goer means the person who performs the action of going, the one who is going away. So what Nagarjuna asked the question, how can we know the goer from the action of going? When he's going, how can we know? with his action. Is going, if you will find out, is going in the person who goes. So going belongs to the goer, the person who is going. Now if going is in the person who goes, because that is his action, he is going. What happens if he stops? If he does not go, then he cannot be called as a goer because he is not going. And if he does not go, there is no going. He's stopping, he's stable at one particular place. Now if going and goer or going away are identical, there are no two activities because it is related with one. These are not two different activities. So Nagarjuna argues that there is no reality in going. If you're using the word going, there is no reality in going because it depends on the goer, the person who is going away. If he stops, then your word of going is of no use. Both the activities, going away or going or goer, you can say to understand easily, both are unreal. Similarly, we find out what Keats is talking about. Keats is talking about how can we know the dancer from the dance. Similarly, the dancer and dance are also unreal. If you apply Nagarjuna's concept, so this kind of Buddhist, there is a Shunyavad. Shunyavad is nothing in modern sense. What are the Nagarjuna's ideas about all those things? There is nothing which could be affirmed of anything independently by itself without a reference of someone else. If you are talking about that, if you want to affirm certain things, you cannot affirm the things independently. That is what Nagarjuna's ideas are. Therefore, nothing could be conceived of as having essence by itself. You cannot conceive with only essence. And that's what Nagarjuna says, all appearances are therefore interdependent. All the appearances are interdependent. You depend on someone else. Or you can say phantom creations, traces, what Derrida talks. And it is precisely, my friends, this interdependence that proves essencelessness of their natures. Because if you are interdependent, you don't have your own separate essence, astitva. All things are relative and hence definable in themselves. There may be no, you will find out, my friends. There is no way of discovering their essences. And since their essences are not identifiable or indescribable, but incomprehensible as well. If you apply the whole concepts of trace and supplementary, Derrida's idea of trace and supplementary, what Nagarjuna is saying. Because Nagarjuna's Ideals are not text oriented like you find it in Derrida. Derrida is talking about text, but Nagarjuna is talking about life. Deconstruction's notion like plurality, interdeterminacy, circularity, or impossibility of getting it right, as emphasized by Derrida, you will find out all those things Nagarjuna is talking about. This is not only in Nagarjuna. I'll just give you passing remarks of certain different ideas of deconstruction that you find it out in Indian knowledge or Indian system of knowledge. Aneka Kantavad, that's the view of Jainism, if you see very carefully, which is another protest movement against supremacy and teachings of the Vedas. It advocates an important doctrine of non-absolutism. If you see Vedas, believe in transcendental self-luminous Brahmin or the supreme reality or truth, the only reality through which everything else is manifested. Is above. Anekatvad of Jainism shows that reality is a pluralistic concept. It expresses itself in multiple forms. And the doctrine of perhapsism, or you can say may, is found in the stories of blind man and elephant. You will find out five men blinded their eyes and touching to the different parts of elephant, and they are thinking what exactly this part is. They don't know that it is a complete elephant. The story which we have seen at our school age. Mahavir in 4th century BC emphasized through this story the impossibility of getting anything right, since reality is ever changing. Please understand this. Reality is ever changing, dynamic, complex, and that any search for absolute or fixed is futile. This in Jainism called as Sayadvad, Sayad Satya, Sayatvad. That is also part of, you can say, idea that deconstruction follows that there is no one absolute meaning. Or in Indian aesthetics, we will find out Bhartrhari in 5th century AD wrote a book called Vakyapadya, Vakyapadya, where he presents a synthetic view of language, philosophy through Sphota theory. And according to him, Sport an integral linguistic symbol which cannot be heard or written, but it manifested through sounds only. The ultimate sport is not uttered by a speaker but heard by the listener. When what is articulated is dhwani or sound, Bhartrhari looks upon sport as an inner entity which reveals itself through the articulated sound. The inner entity has no distinction between the speech and thought and belongs to the level of intuition. All attempts to comprehend the distinction between sound and thought by the intellect may only take us up to some point, and even there we may get a glimpse of that integral whole. We're not going to get everything, glimpse of that. So India, the deconstruction in India, or the concept of relative pluralism that Derrida talks about, the notion that reality can be considered from different points of view, the realization that all is never the same, and even that while it changes, it gives an impression that nothing has changed. The thinking that all judgments are relative and probable, and the faith that the essential nothing is basis for all the changes. And that's why Indian psyche talks about Shanti. Because what we have a faith that essential nothing is basis for all the changes. There is essential nothing. But the change always takes place. And that's why we have to be a position of Shanti. You should be Shanta. That is why you will find out, my friend, Indian philosophy, it is believed that one never enters the same river again. That is what Indian philosophy used to say in context of one bathing in the river. You should not bath in the same river again. By the time you come out and take another dip, the river changes. The body chemistry and the mental makeup of one who is taking bath also changes. So for every dip, you will find out a new river. With its rich pluralistic culture, multilingual, multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, you'll find out there's a revolt against tradition from ancient times to the present day mutations or mutinies. You find out various commentaries as the text in their own right, each supplementing a story of wisdom, my friends. Constantly deconstructing, because Indian system is constantly deconstructing. So understanding deconstruction or applying it is not a big problem for any Indian mind, because Indian mind is always deconstructing things. The only thing that we should come out of the universities and the fossilized thinking and try to learn deconstruction from outside of our day-to-day life also. Indians have been deconstructing without using the label, or often without knowing that they are deconstructing. Indian minds are always deconstructing with their own way, without knowing the title, without knowing the names of it. So if you read deconstruction very carefully, very comfortably, you will find out, my friends, that what Derrida is talking about deconstruction in the end of 20th century or in the last quarter of 20th century, you will find out we are known to it, but we don't know the exact leveling of it. That's why deconstruction is not a difficult task for Indians. That's how we can come to an end with this optimistic note.